Meet Mr. Lion. He's currently in the middle of working through some family issues with his brother. Oh, you want to know how we got to this point? Then allow me to tell thee a tale. For you see. Yeah, no, we're not doing that. Alright, anyways, so this is Mr. Lion. Now meet the things. Mr. Lion spent the first several years of his life fighting barehanded in the woods with a stick. And unlike your Uncle Jerry, this guy actually did everything he tells stories about, if you can get him to drop his whole dark and mysterious stick for a bit. Now our tale begins with our mighty hero choosing the absolute worst spawn location of Caliban. Why is it a terrible spawn location? Because it's a death world, and since death is in the name, I feel I don't need to explain that one, but y'all let me know down in the comments. Moving on. Caliban sat close to the Eye of Terra, which caused a good amount of chaos corruption to the local wildlife, meaning that not only has our man been scrapping since he came out the pod, but that means he's been fighting chaos for longer than any other Primarch, he just didn't know it at the time. And also during this time, our man picked up a few stalkers called the Watchers. They're these little hobbit looking motherfuckers, and I'm sure they surely won't play a role in the story to come. Now it's unknown exactly how long Mr. Lion spent in the woods of Caliban, however when his adoptive father Luther comes to find him, the lion looks to be within his late adolescence, and while the amount of time he spent in the woods is unknown, we can definitely see the effects that it had on young Mr. Lion. Having spent his formative years in isolation and under constant threat, Mr. Lion made cold-blooded silent step and overkill his default perk layout. There's even many times that it's described that even as Astartes, members of the Dark Angels would almost never hear their Primarch approaching or leaving. And I don't know about y'all, but the thought that some 9-foot tall murder machine could just suddenly appear at my shoulder is mildly unsettling to say the least. But the woods also gave him a very cold-hearted reasoning towards things, which is understandable. However, I feel this is what also sets up the Lion to be different from a lot of his other brothers in the future. I'll touch on that more towards the end of the video, just keep that in mind as we pick back up with Mr. Lion and his adoptive father Luther. Luther himself deserves his own video because had the Lion not landed on Caliban at the time that he did, Luther would have been the hero of his age. That's because at this time Caliban was divided into a bunch of knightly orders, with Luther being the rising star of his particular order, but that's a story for another time. What is important about these orders is that they had access to tier 1 power armor, chainswords, and bolt pistols, but they weren't exactly bolt pistols, like you could shoot it without breaking your arm. So flash forward many years and the Lion has done the typical Primarch shit. He's the best thing since sliced bread, he's hunted down to near extinction all of the beasts that once made Caliban a death world, and he's united most of the military orders. But it's during the conquest of this last order that some of the future conflict gets foreshadowed. Luther starts to feel some type of way about the success and praise that the Lion is receiving, but he manages to hide those feelings from most of them, including Mr. Lion himself, because Mr. Lion is socially inept. Flash forward to when the Emperor comes to Caliban and we see a glimpse of the Dark Angel's future as there was an attempt made on the Emperor's life. And you just know the mastermind behind this plan had never even heard a description of the Emperor, because who in their right mind would look at that man and think, oh yeah, a couple frag grenades will do the trick. Luckily for the planet though, Not God was like, I'm gonna let that one slide, and didn't exterminate us the world, which we have to point out for the Emps, pretty progressive. Anyways, Mr. Lion is immediately like, yo, I know you're my dad, I'm sorry my people tried to murk you, but we cool, right? And the Emperor is like, only cause you're my first toy and I can't make any more of you. And Mr. Lion was like, wait, what? And the Emps was like, don't worry about it, let's go meet your brothers. So the Emps takes Mr. Lion and the newly formed Dark Angels to Terra, where Mr. Lion gets to meet his new brothers, and oh boy did he make an impression. While his martial abilities were on par and mostly exceeded that of his brothers, it was his dark, mysterious attitude that really rubbed most of them the wrong way. But this wasn't just a one-sided beef. You see, Mr. Lion didn't like a lot of his brothers either. He thought Sanguinius focused far too much on chivalry to be an effective warlord. He rightfully thought Mortarion was a cunt. He thought the femboy was too obsessed with beauty, and G-Unit was far too rigid within his thinkings. With all of his brothers that he met, he would observe their flaws and judge them pretty harshly for it, a theme I'm sure we won't see repeated within his story. While introductions with his brothers didn't go exactly as planned, we see the Lion take many teachings from Terra and merge them with the knightly orders from Caliban to create this sort of blended culture between the two. And while that culture did help to bridge the gap between the Terran Astartes and the new Astartes from Caliban, there was still some tension between the two. But the culture and the fundamentals of the organization were so strong that they're used even to this day by the Dark Angels and their successor chapters. Now, Mr. Lion being the type of guy that he is, when he does go out to rejoin his sons, it's not necessarily to boost their morale in battle. He doesn't exactly give flowery speeches or make grand promises to them. He just gets in there and starts boxing alongside of them. Which is something I do love about the Dark Angels. In general, if you start shit with them, they don't want to talk to you, they just form up and start walking you down. Gotta respect it. And for several years, Mr. Lion is just off doing his murder pilgrimage and the typical Primarch shit until they get a really shitty assignment to go take on some Xenos known as the Rangdan, which is a Xeno species I ain't got time to fully explain, but TLDR, the Rangdan had been causing some serious problems up in the northern sectors of the Imperium, so much trouble that at one point it looked as if the Xenos could actually eradicate humanity. The fighting got so intense that it is estimated that at least 9 different Space Marine legions took part within the campaign at one point or another. While the Lion was always out in the thick of the fighting, he never really stopped to spend any time to try to encourage his men or rally his forces. He simply went out and stacked bodies and expected you to do the exact same. Now the Dark Angels would eventually stem the tide of the Xenos and purge them from the galaxy entirely, but it took an enormous toll on the Dark Angels. It's estimated that some 50,000 Dark Angels were lost in the campaign, many of them being the battle-hardened veterans of Terra, who were desperately trying to gain some level of acknowledgement from their Gene Father, who was ultimately too cold to show them any. And this is where we can start to see some of the damage from the Force inflicted upon Mr. Lion, because where other Primarchs might look at the death of their sons and feel anything at all, we see the Lion just take on a truly cold attitude towards the death of his children. Mr. Lion never really stops to consider how his surviving sons might feel after such an ordeal, and he really does the only thing that he knows how to do to cope, which is to start planning his next military operation. Because back when he was growing up in the forest, the beast didn't care how hungry or tired or stressed Mr. Lion was, they simply kept attacking and the Lion simply kept fighting. For him, warfare was how he processed trauma, and he was so socially inept that he just assumed that's how his sons would also process their trauma as well. So after falling back to Caliban to reinforce his legion, he sets back out into the Great Crusade with a legion that is much more familiar to him simply because most of the Terran veterans have been wiped out at this point. And we flash forward again to the world of Dulan, where we can see once again Mr. Lion being the absolute worst at any type of social interaction. So the Dark Angels link up with the Space Wolves, and they're headed to this world where the winner of that year's Darwin Awards had called up the Puppy Diddler and was like, "Yo Rush, you ain't shit, I'ma kill you and send your head to the Emperor." Which, I'm kinda just as lost as you are trying to figure out how this man thought he was gonna accomplish that, but flash forward to the assault and it is not going how Governor Dickhead thought it would. Mr. Lion is in the middle of planning the final assault when Governor Dickhead calls up Russ talking even more shit. He's saying Russ does weird things to a puppy, he's calling Russ a bitch, he starts talking all crazy about the Emperor, and Russ just hangs up the call because my man's pretty hot right now, and he turns back over to Mr. Lion and he's like, "Yo, I'm gonna go kill this fuck." And Mr. Lion's like, "That's not part of my plan." And Russ is like, "Then tell me the plan and I'll carry it out." And again, Mr. Lion ain't the most socially able person on the planet, so he looks up at Russ and is like, "You'll fuck it up." Now, Russ had turned around to go start prepping for the assault, but when he hears Mr. Lion say that, he whips back around because he took that a little personally, like most people would. But he finds Mr. Lion had used his teleportation ninjutsu and was already down on the planet. So Russ has to sit back and watch as Mr. Lion kills the person that had just been talking all types of crazy shit to him. Now if I was also a 9-foot-tall murder-addicted pilgrim, I might also be a little upset at this, but Russ takes it a step further. When Mr. Lion gets back up to the ship, Russ walks right up to him and just rocks him, sending Mr. Lion sprawling out on the floor. Mr. Lion, being no stranger to boxing, gets up and immediately just starts boxing with Russ. These two motherfuckers box for a full day before Russ makes what I can only call a fatal mistake. You see, Russ still ain't picked up on the fact that our boy Mr. Lion isn't too socially bright, so Russ stops throwing hands and starts laughing in an attempt to make peace and just go about their separate ways. But he really forgot that Mr. Lion was literally raised by lions, and they taught him a fight was only over when your opponent is defeated. So Mr. Lion rocks Russ with a massive cheap shot that knocks him out cold and then walks off. Fucking baller. This event caused a small beef between the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves, which is still ongoing to today, but it's a lot less hateful and much more respectful nowadays. Now, I'd love to tell you that Mr. Lion starting an eternal beef with the Space Wolves was enough to cause him to do a little bit of self-reflection, but as we move to Sarosh, you'll see that really isn't the case. So Sarosh was a world being brought into compliance by the White Scars, but the levels of bureaucracy on the planet were really preventing anything useful from getting done. And Mr. Khan didn't exactly appreciate his warriors being used as diplomats, so he calls up Mr. Lion and asks him to go take over so his sons could go get back in the fight. Now, Mr. Lion actually respected the Khan because, I mean, let's be honest, it's the Khan, everybody loves this man, so Mr. Lion agrees to go take over negotiations. Now, unbeknownst to the Imperials, the Sarosh were actually Chaos Worshippers, and they were now planning an entire planetary revolt against the Imperium. And during this time, Mr. Lion calls up the leader of the Sarosh and asks them to come up to his ship so they could just get the peace negotiations over with and keep it pushing. And at first it looks like the planet is cooperating with everything until the head honcho himself starts talking mad shit to Mr. Lion. Mr. Lion does the Imperial thing and rams his sword through the guy, which triggers a nuke which had been wired into the diplomat's life signs. Now, where avoiding the assassination attempt of a Primarch would typically be cause for celebration, this time it wasn't. That's because Luther, Mr. Lion's right-hand man and adopted father, had noticed the device when it first came on board, but because of his jealousy, he had considered actually allowing it to go off. While the world was quickly brought into compliance after this little assassination attempt, it wasn't a triumphant victory for the Legion. Mr. Lion finds out about Luther's treachery, leading him to make another fatal decision. He sends Luther and 500 veteran members of the Dark Angels back to Caliban to oversee recruitment. Now, I am in fact not the leader of a death cult. However, if I knew that my right-hand man had just tried to cross me, I personally wouldn't send them to go train the new members of my death cult, but I'm just looking too far into this, right? Surely this won't have any lasting consequences, right? So we flash back to the final years of the Great Crusade, and Mr. Lion is out there doing what he does best, killing Xenos, making every one of his brothers question him. But there was one brother that always tried to reach out to Mr. Reclusive himself. One brother that was always seeking to speak to the Lion. Mr. I'ma fuck up your Imperium himself, Horus. You see, Horus could see how gifted Mr. Lion was at warfare, and while he noted his brother's lack of social skills, he didn't care. Horus didn't need talkers in his rebellion, he needed warriors, and Mr. Lion had few peers in that regards. But Horus also struggled to find any way to manipulate his brother. Angron was easy. Mention some slaughter, he's in. Tell the femboy he's beautiful, he'll do whatever you want. Make Mr. Pringles feel like he's being listened to, he will smash down whatever wall you need him to. But Mr. Lion was a completely different beast. You see, if anyone else was going to be crowned War Master, it would have been the Lion. Horus knew this, so he manipulated events to ensure that the Dark Angels would be nowhere near the Olenor campaign, thus all the credit and glory would go to Horus, and Horus would be crowned War Master. Now Horus thought by doing this he could infuriate the Lion and make him feel some type of way about the Emperor, but what really freaked Horus out was the Lion's complete lack of a reaction. You see, the Lion didn't hit up Horus to shower him with praise or to start throwing a massive temper tantrum. The Lion just started stacking even more bodies and kept it pushing. And this made Horus feel very scared, because he realized he had absolutely no way to manipulate this brother. I think what Horus failed to see was that his brother didn't really operate on emotion, he operated purely on instinct, and it's really heavily alluded to that the Lion just has abnormal chaos resistance, so this endeavor was fucked from the start. When Horus did eventually fall, it was Mr. Lion that he feared fighting the most. To combat this, Horus dispatched the First Legion to the far edges of the Imperium to try and mitigate their involvement within the heresy itself. Which leads us nicely to the Outbreak of the Heresy, where the First Legion was currently bogged down in a campaign against the Gordian League. The Lion, knowing that he couldn't fully disengage from the campaign, gathered up a small strike force to go assault the forged world of Tiamat. Mr. Lion led the attack personally and successfully secured the world and its vital siege engines. However, Pringles showed up shortly afterwards and convinced Mr. Lion that he needed those supplies more than Mr. Lion did. Mr. Lion, hoping to score just a little bit of favor with his brother, is all like, "Yeah, sure man, take mine." And Pringles was all like, "Oh, I'll never forget this," and then starts laughing all maniacally. But as we discussed, Mr. Lion doesn't pick up on social cues, so he thinks nothing of it. And besides, Mr. Lion was far too busy planning all the cool things he was going to do when he became the new War Master when all of this was over. Following the events of Isfahan, Horus would initiate the Thramas Crusade in an attempt to hinder Mr. Lion from aiding the Loyalists, and while the campaign was effective at keeping the Lion busy, it definitely cannot be labeled as a success for the traitors. Many of their worlds fell to Mr. Lion, who even on one occasion managed to trap the Night Haunter aboard his vessel. However, unfortunately for all of the galaxy, Mr. Lion didn't immediately kill him, and the embodiment of insanity managed to escape. But Mr. Lion had bigger problems, like the big fuck-all warp storm that had just cut the entire Imperium in half. He eventually does manage to get his fleet over to Macragge though, where he meets up with the blueberries and the vampires to make a backup Imperium. Mr. Lion then goes back to hunting down curs, which angers Papa Smurf, who feels they need to be focused on defending their new Imperium Secundus, and really didn't like how Mr. Lion was going about this whole thing. Eventually, Mr. Lion captures Curs again and brings him to stand trial before his brothers again. And during the trial, Curs starts talking mad shit to Mr. Lion, who then tries to kill Curs, which this angers Papa Smurf for some reason, who then exiles the Lion from Imperium Secundus. Because it's not like there's a massive rebellion going on that requires all of you to work together to stop it or anything. I mean, please, just continue having a dick measuring competition. Anyways, Mr. Lion flicks them the bird and grabs his homies, dips out. But as he's leaving, he remembers something that Dr. Insane said, so he rushes back to the chamber where God's best boy was about to kill God's most insane boy. And Mr. Lion's like, yo, wait, he said the Emperor was gonna send an assassin to kill him. And everyone's like, yeah. And Mr. Lion's like, no, you don't get it. If he's saying the Emperor is going to send somebody, that means that Dad is still alive. And Smurf Daddy and the bestest boy look at one another and they're like, oh yeah, you're right. So they stop playing Pretend Imperium and start looking for a way through the big fuck-all warp storm. This leads them to the world of Davin, where after a massive ground battle and where Mr. Lion starts to gain some semblance of human understanding, fights alongside his brother Guilliman. After Davin is destroyed, a portal to Terra is open, but the Loyalists find a massive traitor fleet guarding it. Mr. Lion and Papa Smurf volunteer to distract them so the vampires can make it to Terra. After his brother made it to Terra, Mr. Lion decided to strike out against the traitors in a hope to lure some of the forces off of Terra itself, and while he was able to destroy several of his brother's homeworlds, eventually the light of the Astronomicon went dark and Mr. Lion feared the worst. He repositioned his forces over to the world of Deliverance, where he once again learned a little bit more social skills and set aside his differences with Russ to work towards the defeat of the traitors. However, during their counterattack, word reached him of the result of the Battle of Terra itself. The traitors had been repelled, but many of his brothers were dead, and the Emperor himself had been wounded and superglued to a golden toilet. So Mr. Lion is really not feeling life at this point, and he heads back to Caliban to try to figure out his next move. But remember Luther, his right-hand man, and the fact that his world was already touched by the Hand of Chaos? Yeah, this is about to get a lot worse for Mr. Lion. As soon as Mr. Lion's fleet gets within range, orbital defense batteries on the surface begin to fire upon them. After pulling back to assess the situation, Mr. Lion learns that it's Luther who has betrayed him. And with the heresy still fresh in his mind, Mr. Lion reacts the only way that he knows how to. Mr. Lion begins to assault his own homeworld, initiating bombardment that even Pringles would be proud of. After his ships absolutely laid waste to the world, Mr. Lion descends to the surface to finish the job. He comes face to face with his old friend and adoptive father, Luther, at the very fortress monastery that he once called home. The battle was absolutely titanic, and if you're lost as to how this man that had always lived in his father's shadow could now stand toe-to-toe with him, it's because he was on those chaos steroids. And like all steroids, they're bad for your soul and come with some serious consequences. Luther found that out as he struck down Mr. Lion with the Psychic Blast, and while this should have been Luther's moment of triumph, it wasn't. Because in that moment, he suddenly realized what he had done and just how far he had fallen, and immediately he feels regret and starts seeking forgiveness from the Lion. The Chaos Gods, being the Chaos Gods, don't exactly like character development, so they sent a warp storm to engulf the planet. The planet was mostly destroyed, however, what remained of the Order's fortress monastery became the Legion's flagship known as the Rock. Mr. Lion was sucked into the warp but was rescued by his stalkers, the Watchers in the Dark, who pulled him back from the warp and placed him into a stasis chamber deep within the rock. He took a small 10,000 year nap before reawakening during the Arks of Omen campaign. He fucked Angeron up and sent that raging berserker back into the warp for a bit before going to hunt down his fallen sons. Mr. Lion isn't hunting the fallen for the sake of extermination, but to talk with them and even bring them back into the fold of the Dark Angels. These once members of the fallen are now taken up as the Lion's Risen. One thing I love about the Dark Angels, you gotta appreciate their naming. Very simple, very straightforward. But regardless, I think we can see this isn't a Lion who is so focused on vengeance or caught up in wrath that he would cut down his own sons without a second thought. This is a Lion that wants to forgive past transgressions and move forward into a better Imperium. I think this is why people have come to love the Lion so much recently. Not because he's the new shiny toy on the market, but because he has a very noticeable change in his character arc. He changes from a one-dimensional killer into someone that sees the nuance of things and recognizes his own role within the heresy and how he himself caused the fall of some of his sons. But he isn't just stopping at recognizing his involvement, he's actively working to correct the damages that he's done. This is more development than even Papa Smurf, who admittedly is different than he was during the Heresy era, but not by this much. The modern day 40k Gilliman has always read to me as a man that seems somewhat lost, and I know that might sound weird, but maybe I'll explain that one day. For now though, this has been Mr. Lion Poorly Explained. Thank you all so much for listening. I genuinely appreciate y'all. The Khan himself will be up next, but if there's any other topics you're interested in me covering, just let me know down in the comments. Again, thank you all so much for your time. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning, whatever. Deuces.